Hey friends, welcome to another edition of This Missional Monday, where each week we look at what it means to be the people of God following in Jesus' mission for us in our communities, to live as everyday missionaries where we live, work, and play. This week's topic that we're going to be talking about is the church, and I'm asking the question, what is the church? What does it mean when we say that word church? Now that might sound like a simple question with a simple answer, right? Because when we talk about church in our everyday lives, we sometimes refer to church as a worship service. Like somebody says, I went to church on Sunday, referring to that worship service. Some people say, well, I was driving by and I saw your church, referring to a building. If we were to look up in most English dictionaries, you're going to find a number of definitions, but most of them center around those three things of a building where people gather, a hierarchy that exists, like the Roman Catholic Church is a very hierarchical church, or the church as an organization that is set up, that kind of has that structure and institution to it. The English word that we have for church, of course, comes all the way back into the Greek. It comes through the German from the Greek kuriakon, which literally meant the Lord, something committed to the Lord's. It was kind of used in that context of the Lord's house, as like the Lord's building. But what's interesting is, when we look at the New Testament, we don't ever find that word used for the word that we would translate as church. In fact, when you're looking in your New Testament and you find that word church, it's actually ecclesia, which means the called out ones. It was a word that could be used for when you called out like a crowd or any group of people, tradesmen pulled together. It was an assembly, is really a better translation of that. But more specifically, when it's used in the New Testament, it's used to refer to the people of God who are called out to follow after Jesus together. In Matthew 16:18, Jesus referred to his own followers as his ecclesia, his church. And as we read on in the New Testament, we find that it kind of refers to all followers of Jesus, what we call the universal church, spread out through time in all different places, and local church, in one geographic place, in a city or a town, or one group, one congregation, we might call it. But it's a very different understanding between these two. When we're talking about church, we're so often talking about a building. But it appears 111 times, ecclesia, church, in the New Testament, and every single time it's referring to people. It's never referring to a building. In fact, the early church didn't have a building at all. They met wherever they needed to, often in houses. For the first 300 years, it wasn't until the Edict of Milan by Emperor Constantine in 313 AD that Christianity was legalized in the Roman Empire and they could start to build church buildings. They could build their own cathedrals and so forth. So for 300 years, the church was really more of a network, right? In one city, you'd have a network of house churches, and they would have what we'd call bishops, and they would oversee this entire network of house churches, of these different communities of faith together following after Jesus. Now, I think it's so important to understand this shift, to see what it really means to be the church, because I think we're held back by this thinking that church is just a worship service, or church is just a hierarchy, or church is just a building. And I think we need to change our language in how we talk about church. Then instead of saying, well, I'm going to church, referring to a worship service on Sunday, we need to say, I'm going to worship. Or if we're going to the building, we say, I'm going to the building, the church building, where we meet and gather. We need to stop seeing this idea of I go to church and realize that we are the church. If you are a Christian, you are the church. The church only exists in people, by the Holy Spirit, dwelling with God's people, following after Jesus together. If people say that they've seen our church, don't have to correct them and say, well, that's not my church. That's my church's building. You just say, oh, you saw my church's building. You saw where my church meets. It's a very subtle way in our language that communicates that difference. And I was thinking about it. I don't know how many times as a kid and even as a pastor I've heard very kind-hearted little old ladies yelling at children saying, don't run in God's house. We can correct them and say, well, actually, this isn't God's house. God's house is not a building. God's house is people. And I don't know what to tell them other than that. Maybe you could just tell kids, please slow down and don't run because you don't want to bust all your teeth out. That would be true. But to call it God's house, that would not be true. So as we go into the comment section today, I've got a little tool that'll help, but I want to ask the question, what if the church is a community of followers of Jesus Christ empowered by his Spirit and not just a building, what is essential for the church? Like, what are the things that you actually need to be the church and to live as the church? I'm going to have a list of those different options. I want you to pick the ones that you think are absolutely necessary. And I hope to see some good comments in the section below. As always, if you have any questions, I am always open to hear. We'll dig in next week a little more into the theology, if you like that, of how we got to this position where we talk about church as a building rather than the people of God. Well, thanks again for tuning in. Again, I hope to see your comments below.